I think you can describe the cuts that he's made since he has been in office as a bit of a slaughter. There have been cuts, for example, to tax credits for renewable energy, wind, solar, electric vehicles. There were also cuts or planned cuts affecting major upgrades of electrical grids. So around 7.5 billion for hundreds of projects. And if you could believe it, mostly in democratic areas. But I think one of the cuts that's had the most impact is grants for programs like Solar for All program, where more than 7 billion in funding was cut for expanding solar energy in low-income communities. So that was seen as a particular loss. But there have also been sweeping cuts made across organizations like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And that was an organization that provided climate and weather research globally. So it's not only having an impact within the US, but also outside. And then obviously towards the beginning of the year, there were the firings from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy also.
And we should say, though, that there are some subsidies which remain in place, for example, when it comes to nuclear, grid storage, or even clean tech components, though the projects that those components would go into have been rolled back.
Yeah, that's right. But you said the word slaughter, Louise. So I'm wondering, what's been the impact of this massive tranche of cuts?
I mean, if we go back to the Solar for All program, for example, that was put in place to give around 900,000 households access to solar power, which would have led to them having cheaper energy access. And this was for communities with low incomes. They would have seen energy for electricity, for example, drop by about 20%. So that is something that they are losing out on as a result of this. There have been clean tech firms that have reported to have cancelled around $24 billion in new projects, according to some analyses. That's thousands of jobs that are being lost as a result of that. And it's also hitting things like, the modernization of the grid, energy storage for renewables, and also efforts to protect communities from outages during extreme weather events, which the US is hugely prone to. I mean, we've seen flooding in Texas, for example, earlier this year. And right at the beginning, I don't know if you remember the wildfires that decimated parts of LA. And so all of these things have an impact on that level as well.
Okay. And so we have to say, though, hundreds of thousands of jobs and the electricity price going up for average Americans as well, according to lots of different sources that are monitoring this kind of thing. But what was the reasoning behind all of this? Why did Trump decide to roll back the green subsidies?
I mean, I think there are the various reasons. I mean, it's no secret that President Trump is a bit of a climate skeptic. He's called climate change a con job and a hoax. And so on that level, he just does not believe that those things need to be in place, or presumably. But, there were rules put in place by the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. And he was rolling back some of those things. And there was even a statement that came out from the White House at the beginning of his presidency that said that they wanted to focus on fossil fuel because, the US has an abundance of energy and natural resources that have historically powered our nation's economic prosperity. I'm quoting there from the press release or the statement that they put out about that. I mean, let's not forget the US is the biggest oil producer in the world. It's also one of the biggest natural gas producers in the world. And the arguments that they were making were that they would be able to provide cheaper energy for manufacturing by taking, by using those resources that the US has and providing job creation, etc., through fossil fuels instead. But, there are reports that have shown that renewables have dropped dramatically in cost and are much cheaper than fossil fuels. And obviously they are more accessible and don't have the climate problems associated with them that fossil fuels do.
Right. And you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I'm wondering, are we seeing a division here specifically along party lines?
I mean, it's not specific because there are impacts that have been made on red states as a result of the cuts that we've seen. The the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, was giving a lot of funding to red states, and by rolling that back, that funding is also being taken away from those areas as well. Saying that, the Democratic Party is obviously behind a lot of the renewables projects and the advancements that the US had made in stepping forward to deal with the climate crisis. And in that way, it's very much down party lines. We just saw Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, for example, at the International Climate Summit, talking about the Californian Green Agenda, but also talking about how he doesn't want to cede power for the renewables market over to China, which is obviously taking huge advantage of the fact that the US is stepping out of this renewables race to a large degree.
Right.
Saying all of that, there are lots of democratic states, I think, are up there who are trying to fight against some of these cuts and changes that have been made by the Trump administration.
Yeah, and of course, there's the argument about that it's the IRA funding in particular increased inflation, that there was too much waste on unproven projects as well as reasons why Trump has done this. Of course, that's not necessarily that anyone's going to argue against a review, but this was definitely a massive rollback. And also we've seen Trump has decided not to attend the COP climate summit in Brazil. That's the UN organized climate conference. And so how does that reflect his approach to green policies? So is it a snub of climate change policies in general, or is it just that he is against these kinds of big UN organized conferences? He's more skeptical of that kind of multilateral coordination?
I mean, I don't think it's a secret that he has shown some skepticism towards the UN in general, but this is definitely something that is associated very much with his views on climate change. I mean, his first day in office, he pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which is the agreement that nations made to try to reduce carbon emissions to stop rises in temperature. That was something that he had already done in his first term. As I said before, he's also called climate change a hoax and a con job. And I think, his views are very much reflected by the fact that he has not taken part in this conference that is taking place. Saying that, there has been a lot of relief to some degree that is the case, because countries were a little fearful of the US coming in and, the rollbacks that they've seen domestically in the US. The Trump administration may be also trying to influence the talks and get countries to also look at rolling back in their own countries.
Wow.
And
okay.
we've seen evidence of this. I mean, we've seen evidence of this at other negotiations. The International Maritime Organization, for example, was looking at cutting carbon emissions in shipping. And there were reports of bullying and intimidation from the Trump administration, trying to get countries to not move forward in those negotiations, to the point where the decision has actually been postponed as a result.
And thank you very much to Louise for breaking that down for us. But Kassandra, you've also been digging a bit deeper on this.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about here that I really wanted to unbraid this a bit and to find out more about what all this means for the US, energy prices, and its competition with China, which we heard a little bit about already. I spoke to Hamad Hussain from Capital Economics. The world's second biggest superpower, China, is neck and neck with the U.S. in the race to making cutting-edge artificial intelligence. How does its energy costs play into this whole conversation?
Yeah, I think particularly on the sort of energy side, China does seem to have an advantage over the US when it comes to the development of AI. This is partly a function of the policy infrastructure in China very much being state-led, and there's very much a view in China that if the state orders more energy or more renewable energy to be built out, then more renewable energy will be built out, and things can move very quick pace in China. So over there, what we're seeing more broadly as well, not just related to the AI development, but more broadly, China is very much also a leader in green tech, solar manufacturing, wind turbine manufacturing, and that is something that they'll probably utilize over the coming years. We'll probably see China continue to add plenty more solar capacity, plenty more wind capacity in order to power their own development of AI over the coming years.
I was reading an update from your firm, Capital Economics, that pointed out that some forms of, quote, low carbon energy technology, end quote, have been actually spared from these cuts that we've been hearing about. Is the Trump administration boosting these technologies on purpose in your view, or is this just kind of a happy accident? And what are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think the Trump administration, while on the whole, particularly when it comes to solar and wind, it has been vocal in its opposition to the build out of those forms of energy. It's equally been almost just as vocal in its support for nuclear power, which is one form of low carbon energy. In particular, nuclear has retained a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act incentives. And also the Trump officials within the Trump administration have also signaled their support for certain nuclear projects too. So that's one area where we may see, or that's at least one form of energy that could be a winner from all this. There could be an increased push to develop nuclear power. That is also one form of baseload power that could support the development of AI too.
Now, we talked about the intermittency of solar and wind energy, right? And so one of the things that can help bridge these periods where maybe there's less energy being produced is, of course, battery storage. What do these cuts from the Trump administration mean for this technology that's going to be really critical if what we're talking about is an actual green transition here?
Yeah, so I think there's two headwinds facing the build out of battery storage here. One of them is, as you correctly alluded to, is the cuts to federal subsidies and the loss of support. In that sense, of course, if there's less incentive for consumers to install battery storage, as well as utility scale firms, then that will, all else equal, slow the build out of battery storage. We're also seeing an impact from the tariffs that have been levied, particularly on Chinese-made batteries. The US, whilst it doesn't import a great deal of solar or other green tech from China, it is quite reliant on battery imports from China. And so tariffs are adding to the cost of battery storage, and again, slowing down the rollout in that way too.
So zooming out here, the US is competing with China, it's competing with other economies as well. Do cutting back on these subsidies actually make the US less competitive?
I think in some senses, the US could become less competitive as a result of these cuts to clean energy subsidies, particularly in the long run as well. The direction of travel seems to be that clean energy is going to help lower costs, lower the cost of energy, and that will, of course, have an impact on more generally production costs around the world. So if you're slower in terms of adopting these clean energies and integrating them into your production, then of course that will have an impact on your long run competitiveness. So the US could fall behind slightly in that respect.
On the one hand, we've been talking about how just like massive these cuts have been from the Trump administration. But on the other hand, he's kind of been promising this since day one. He came into office promising to roll back these green initiatives. So 9 months on, in your view, has he actually lived up to his promises, or are you potentially surprised at maybe where he was merciful, I guess is maybe the way I'll put it?
Yeah, I think Trump has definitely I think he's lived up to the rhetoric, and I think actually surprisingly as well. As we spoke about earlier, um, a lot of the tax credits and subsidies were headed towards Republican states. So a lot of analysts were expecting perhaps some mercy from the Trump administration in terms of cutting back on these subsidies. So I'd say he's definitely lived up to his rhetoric so far.
Do you think there have been any surprises for you in terms of what he's done or hasn't done?
Yeah, I think for me, I think the scale at which I think the speed at which the Trump administration has moved to cut some of these subsidies and sort of pull back in support, not just sort of financial support, but also more generally changes in regulation. I think the speed at which this is all has happened has taken quite a few analysts by surprise. So I think that's the main thing, really. Not necessarily what has happened, but rather just how quickly President Trump has been able to move with his agenda.
Right. Not that I'm asking you to break out your crystal ball here, but are you expecting the renewable share in the US energy mix to increase or decrease during the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think the renewable share in the US energy mix is still on track to increase, but at a much slower pace than under the Biden administration.
Right.
There's a lot of there's a lot of good stories happening on the ground in terms of some state policies remaining fairly supportive, but also the economics of clean energy still makes sense even without federal support. So we will continue to see renewables being built out, but at a much slower pace than what we've previously seen.
And that was just a taste and a amuse-bouche of our podcast, The Dip. If you want to hear more or see more, check out the QR code that's on your screen right now.